Bristol, 1967. A 17-year-old widow, Louisa Dunn, was brutally attacked in her own home. For decades, the case went cold, despite thousands of palm prints collected and evidence carefully preserved. But in 2024, a breakthrough in DNA technology unlocked the truth. More than half a century later, Ryland Headley, by then 92 years old, was brought to justice. In June 2025, he was convicted of rape and murder, making this Britain's oldest solved cold case. This is the haunting story of how a single blue skirt stored since 1967 became the key to solving a crime that time almost forgot. Bristol, late June 1967. A warm night exhales over terrace streets. Curtains breathe with the draft. A gas ring clicks somewhere, and the clock leans past midnight. Behind a modest front door, a woman in her mid-70s prepares for bed, tidying, folding, doing the last small rituals that make a house feel safe. But safety is a story we tell ourselves. By morning, neighbours will crowd the pavement, police will mark off the walkway, and a city will whisper the name Louisa Dunn, a widow, a mother, a grandmother whose life was taken inside her own home in an attack so pitiless it would haunt detectives for nearly 6 decades. Tonight, we tell a story of patience, of evidence sealed in brown paper, of fingerprints taken by the thousand, of cases consigned to cold, and then, one improbable day, revived. It is the story of a murder in 1967, and the 92-year-old man who finally heard a judge tell him, "You will die in prison." On the night of June 27th to 28th, 1967, Louisa Dunn, a 74-year-old widow, was at home in Bristol. By the following morning, she was found dead, assaulted and strangled, the room clotted with the signs of his struggle marks that speak even when the witness cannot. These are details that rarely make headlines at first. They are meticulous, clinical, and devastating. The person responsible left behind traces, enough to suggest how the attack unfolded, too little to assign a name. Court and tribunal ludicrousy. What the public did learn was terrifying in its simplicity. An elderly woman attacked inside the place she should have been safest. There would be no confession, no immediate suspect, and no clean line from crime to courtroom. Just grief and a growing file of reports, photos and exhibits that investigators carefully catalogued and stored. Amongst those exhibits, Louisa's blue skirt, folded away and kept for reasons that would become clear only half a century later. 1967, policing had skill and rigour, but not DNA. Not yet. What they did have were fingerprints and palm prints. Detectives canvassed, collected and compared until the numbers sounded impossible. 19,000 local men provided palm prints to try to match one left at the scene. 19,000. It was a civic exercise in elimination, and still the matches did not come. The murder remained unsolved, an open wound in the records. Time to strange things to unsolved crimes. Memory phrase, witnesses move, age, pass away. Investigative practices evolve. Scientists build new instruments to ask old evidence new questions. Meanwhile, families absorb the absence, the not knowing. In Bristol, the case file with Louisa Dunn on the tab migrated from active investigation to the shelves of cold cases waiting for a reason to come back to life. And then, more than 5 decades later, that reason arrived. In 2023, Avon and Somerset Police's major crime review team, cold case specialists, reassessed the file. Among the items was that blue skirt Louisa had worn. It was shipped for modern forensic testing. In September 2024, a miracle of modern science emerged from old cloth. A full DNA profile. That single profile became a bridge from 1967 to now. Databases can be heartbreaks. Most queries come back empty, but this time there was a hit thanks to a sample entered years earlier for an unrelated matter. When investigators compared the 2024 profile to a man named Ryland Headley, the result was not just suggestive, it was powerful. The scientific certainty would later be described in court as astronomically high on the order of $1 billion to 1 against chance supported, further by a palm print match. The trace left on a window in 1967 finally had a name to stand beside it. On November 19, 2024, officers travelled to Ipswich to arrest Ryland Headley. By then, 92 years old, he was questioned and charged that same day with the rape and murder of Louisa Dunn. A man who had drifted through life for nearly 6 decades beyond the reach of this crime was now facing the evidence curated by time itself. News outlets marvelled at the gap between crime and courtroom. But age is not absolution. It is simply more time between a harm and its reckoning. Police and prosecutors began preparing for trial correlating that could be recovered of 1967 with what could be tested of 2024. The Crown Prosecution Service reviewed the file, evaluated the DNA and palm print evidence, and prepared to bring a jury into the narrative at last. June 2025, Bristol Crown Court. The trial of Ryland Headley begins. A jury takes their seats to hear a story that started before some of them were born. The prosecution reconstructs the nights from the scars it left, the assault inside the home, the strangulation, the traces evidence preserved in envelopes that have yellowed over decades. They present the DNA profile recovered from Louisa's skirt, the modern match to Headley, and the confirmatory palm print identification linking his hand to the scene where Louisa was suffocated. They call witnesses, neighbours from 1967 who remembered cries, the doctor who originally pronounced death, forensic scientists who explain how molecules endure and how probabilities seek. The jury also hears about Headley's history. In the late 1970s, he was convicted of raping 2 elderly women, crimes with haunting similarities to the violence inflicted on Louisa. The past, held at the edges of this case for decades, was suddenly centre stage, a pattern of offending that travelled forward into the courts to meet the new science. The defence argues that what remains in so many cold cases, the passage of time, the fragility of recollection, and questions about continuity of exhibitions. But the heart of the case is modern and quantitative. The DNA does not know what decade it was found in. It only knows how compatible it is with the defendant. The palm print lifted in 1967 and once compared against 19,000 local men to no avail, aligns now with the man in the dock. Science had given the past a voice. On June 30th, 2025, the jury returns its verdict, guilty of rape and murder. 2 words that unwind 58 years of not knowing. A day later, July the 1st, 2025, Mr. Justice Sweeting sentenced Riley Headley to life imprisonment, imposing a minimum term of 20 years. In the judge's own words, spare the devastating Headley will die in prison. The law applied was the law of 1967, a reminder that justice travels on the timeline of the crime. Sentencing remarks are as close as the justice system comes to eulogy. They are formal, but they're also human. In Bristol Crown Court, Mr. Justice Sweeting began by speaking about Louisa Dunn, not just as a victim in a case, but as a woman, 74 years old at the time of her death, a widow, a person with a life textured by family, community and the ordinary rituals that make a day. He described the crime plainly: rape and murder in the sanctuary of a home, asphyxiation by strangulation and pressure to the mouth, an attack that was pitiless and cruel. The judge acknowledged the decades of anguish endured by Louise's family. He weighed Headley's age and health against the severity of the offences and certainty of the evidence. Justice does not rehearse time, it measures harm, and in this measure the court found that only life could answer for a life taken. Outside the courtroom, statements from the Crown Prosecution Service and Avon and Somerset Police echoed the same themes: the power of preserved exhibits, the tireless labour of cold case review teams, and a commitment to pursue even the oldest crimes. Investigators publicly traced the chain that led here: the 2023 review, the September 2024 DNA profile from the blue skirt, the November 2024 arrest and charge, the June 2025 conviction, the July sentencing. The chain is both scientific and human. Every link is people choosing to look again. What does it mean to solve a 58-year-old murder? On paper, it's a statistic, the UK's oldest solved case, a point of pride for a force and a prosecutor's office. In practice, it's a tapestry of careful decisions made by people who would never meet one another. The 1967 officers who labelled an evidence bag correctly, the 1970s technician who stored prints and kept a chain of custody, the 2020 scientists who extracted a profile from fibres aged beyond memory. It's an unbroken line of stewardship across generations. And then there are the families. Louise's loved ones, children, grandchildren lived with a question that had no words. Over time, grief learns to live in a house, but unanswered violence is noisy. It moves through rooms and generations. The verdict doesn't ease the crime, but it changes the sound in the house. It lets memories speak in the past tense without a question mark. There's also lessons about persistence. In an era where police budgets and expertise are under pressure, cold case workers can feel like archaeology a luxury rather than a necessity. But this result argues the opposite. The oldest evidence can contain the newest truth if we keep it, honor it, and ask the right questions at the right time. Even the skeptics, those who warn that such breakthroughs may be rare wins in a constrained system, acknowledge the symbolic force of this case. It's proof of concept written in a life sentence. Who was Ryland Headley? The court heard fragments. A railway machinist, a man who left Bristol after the murder, who decades later raped elderly women and served time. His DNA was taken in 2012 during an unrelated matter and added to the national database, a routine act that would eventually intersect with the skirt. Stored since 1967. He aged, as we all do, but aged sits lightly on guilt. In court, reporters described a man in his early 90s listening to his fate through hearing aids. Justice is not theatrical, it is procedural, and yet moments like this arrive with a hush. The judge's final words drew a straight line from 1967 to 2025, a crime committed when the Beatles were on the radio, judged when most music is a stream. You will die in prison, he told Headley, not as an epitaph, but as a mathematical statement, a life's reminder inside walls. Let's return to the blue skirt. It is, in some ways, the protagonist of the story. Its hospitable fibres taken in the world, trapping skin cells, semen and other biological material in a weave that can survive decades in dry storage. In the 1960s, this was an evidentiary curiosity. Today, it's a DNA reservoir. When that reservoir yielded a full profile in 2024, it wasn't a single eureka moment, it was the culmination of method, controlled handling, modern extraction, amplification, and comparison. Every stage validated, every possibility of contamination accounted for. Science is slow on purpose. Then there's a palm print. Fingerprint history is full of near misses and false leads. A partial, smudged, or disoriented impression can generate doubt, but in this case, palm evidence recorded in 1967, painstakingly lifted and preserved, later matched Headley. That prince once defeated a 19,000-man canvas. Decades later, it corroborated the DNA. The two strands, old and new, twisted into a rope strong enough to hold in court. After the canvas packed away and the papers filed their final updates, stories like this passed back to the people who lived inside them. Louisa's family issued statements of relief and sorrow, thanking the investigators who kept looking. Police signaled that other cold cases, particularly attacks on elderly women in the 1970s and 80s, may now be reviewed with fresh eyes. A ripple effect from one conviction. The past is not quiet, it echoes. From Bristol, the case becomes part of local memory, one of those stories that older residents recall in fragments, now with an ending. And for every cold case team in the country, it is a case study to cite when budgets are debated and storage space is rationed. Why we keep the skirt, why we keep the print, why we keep faith that a day will come when the evidence can speak at last. Justice is often imagined as swift, a siren, a chase, a courtroom crescendo. Justice is more frequently an accretion. Careful notes, meticulous labels, routine submissions to labs, a detective reading on a Sunday, a scientist trying a new protocol on an old sample. It takes the long way home. For Louisa Dunn, the road was 58 years long, but it got there. The jury's verdict and the judge's sentence do not undo what was done in that Bristol home in 1967. They do something subtler and in a way more profound. They acknowledge reality in public. They say this happened, he did it, and we remember. If you or someone you love is living with an unsolved crime, know this. Somewhere, evidence is waiting for a better question. Somewhere, a case file is about to be opened again. And sometimes, when custody is careful and people are patient, the past answers.